Well, we have some tragic news that we want to talk about with you. Yesterday, police confirmed that 35-year-old woman, Christina Yuna Lee, was brutally murdered in her Manhattan home by a man who had multiple misdemeanors on his record. Lee was allegedly trailed by her assailant, who police have named as 25-year-old Asamad Nash, into her apartment building. Surveillance footage showed Nash following Lee on her way back to her apartment when they go off camera.
According to the New York Times, neighbors called police after hearing a disturbance. After arriving at the scene, police found that Nash had barricaded himself inside Lee's apartment. When they were able to enter, they arrested Nash on the spot. Lee was found fatally stabbed to death in her bathtub. While police have not confirmed that the killing was racially motivated or suggested that it was, Lee's murder has triggered fears in the Asian community in New York City and across the country, which has seen an uptick in targeted attacks during the pandemic.
The NYPD reported anti-Asian hate crimes in the city increased by nearly fourfold in 2021, 361%. New York State Assembly candidate and community organizer Grace Lee and senior editor for the Post Millennial Libby Emmons join us now to weigh in. Thank you both for being with us.
Thanks.
So Grace, we're seeing, or a lot of people are saying, advocacy groups, that there's increased crime against this specific community. What do you make of that, and what is the solution if that is indeed the case?
Thanks. That's a great question. I mean, I think that we're seeing an increase in violence against Asians, especially Asian women. Within 1 month, we saw an Asian woman pushed into the subway tracks, Michelle Go, in Times Square. And then we saw this horrific, tragic accident. Our community is beside itself right now. We are mourning the deaths of our sisters in our community. And, we also want our voices to be heard right now. We need real community engagement around the crime that is happening in our communities. And, we really need more funding to help our communities right now.
I'm wondering, what do you think is the actual reason? Do you think it is like the anti-China rhetoric that we're hearing over and over and over again? Do you think that has to do with this, or like the virus, or, I mean, what do you think it is?
I think that there's certainly some underlying racism that is driving, even if it's not explicit, if it's implicit. I think Asians are considered more passive or meek, and especially Asian women have been hypersexualized in our society. And I think that definitely has made us bigger targets. I'll just give you an example. Just yesterday, ABC News made a mistake on my name in an interview they did with me, and they identified me as Michelle Go on the screen. And this kind of interchanging of Asian women, this idea that, it doesn't, we're all the same, and we all look the same, and we are the same person, is, dehumanizing to us as a community and as individuals, and it makes us more vulnerable to attacks.
Libby, what do you think about this? I mean, I don't know. I find it personally hard to. We hear a lot of blame in the mainstream media about how, we used to hear about how Trump's rhetoric is responsible for unleashing these waves of violence, et cetera. But then, we can take a look at this guy. I doubt he's a Trump voter. He's a crazy person. How do we grapple with the media draws these easy associations between political rhetoric, et cetera. The reality seems to me to be a lot more like crazy, drug-addicted homeless people, attacking people, and then a lot of them have happened to be Asian women, of course, but it's not the only category of people getting attacked. What do you make of it?
I think that when you have a city that stops caring about its residents, that stops enforcing small crimes and prosecuting those small crimes, you're going to see more and more women attacked. Not just Asian women. We have seen a lot of Asian women attacked, and I think that Grace is right in much of what she said. But we've also seen women who are not Asian on subways people have been trying, there's been an increase in people trying to rape women in broad daylight on the subway system. We've seen that. We've seen a lot of attacks against women. A young woman living alone, leading a creative lifestyle in New York City should not have to fear for her life by crazy people wandering into her building and murdering her senselessly. This is not the kind of crime that New Yorkers are used to seeing over the past decade or so, probably more than that. And it's really a shame that leaders like Bill de Blasio have let the city just, run to the ground like this. I think it has a lot more to do with really horrible policies on crime and, a disregard for New Yorkers by the past administration.
Yeah, and Grace, it can be a combination of factors, right? I'm curious for your take on this. I mean, the pandemic, has led to a collapse in access to social services and has led to a real, kind of visible increase in mentally ill people out on the street and just acting out in general. Curious if you've seen that as well. But then I think it slots into your point about implicit bias. So the question would be, why does somebody who's suffering some mental break, some nervous breakdown, why would they attack an Asian American woman rather than some other woman? And I think maybe that's where some of that implicit bias comes in. But do we have a sense of whether attacks have risen, forget the motivation, but if attacks have risen more against Asian women than against, say, white women in New York City?
Yeah, I can't say I don't have the statistics exactly on Asian women, but I know that we've seen, a huge increase in attacks against Asian Americans and Asians in New York City. So that is definitely a fact, and that is a result of what you've talked about, this freedom to speak poorly of Asians, the racism that we've seen all the way at the top at the White House, all the way and trickling down, and also this belief that we are vulnerable targets. That is definitely something that I believe is driving some of the specific attacks against Asians.
And there's like here in Los Angeles, we had a really horrible situation recently, and it was this woman, a white young girl, working in a furniture store, and a homeless man ventured into the furniture store when she was there working by herself, and he stabbed her to death. And then a customer later walked in and found her, and that was obviously she wasn't Asian, so there wasn't, they didn't classify that as a hate crime. But it's interesting and kind of thinking about this, because I have the same question that Ryan just had and that Libby was just talking about, is, are we really seeing an increase in hate, in the targeting of Asians because of the rhetoric, or is this something else? Because when I do look at the statistic that we're talking about, the one that we just cited that says that the hate crimes rose by 361%, which is enormous, from 28 incidences last year in New York City to 129 as of Sunday. That was in a one-year time span. So that is obviously an enormous increase. But then again, when it comes to hate crimes, I mean, that's different than murder. I would like to see the murder stats specifically. Or even just the
or
physical
violent assault, right?
Violent assault,
yeah,
right.
That includes graffiti. That includes, it includes everything.
Right. So it'd be good to kind of see those actual, the breakdown of those stats to say, okay, because I know with hate crimes we do, and maybe Libby, you could kind of talk about this, but we do we've changed the definition of hate crimes over the years. We can include more and more things into that, which kind of causes some of the rates to go up when you start to say, well, graffiti then does count as a hate crime.
Also, we end up obsessing over the racial identity of the victim, but like the perpetrators in 90% of these cases are going to be black men. So that there's an obvious statistical bias in the race and gender makeup of the perpetrators that no one ever tries to draw any conclusions from that. It focuses entirely on the maybe, possibly you can find some that is right. There's more against Asian women, maybe, but the most obvious demographic vector is actually the gender of the perpetrator, because it's always men, and then usually in New York at least it's always black men. What do you think, Libby?
Misogyny is not classified as any kind of hate crime, right? I mean, a lot of this is violence against women. That's what we're seeing here. That's what we saw with Michelle Go. That's what we saw. That's what we saw here, and that's never going to go away, right? You're going to have men murdering women since the beginning of time. That's going to keep happening, and that's not classified as a hate crime. And I think it's a real problem that you have women who are going to be afraid to walk by themselves at night. They're always going to be looking over their shoulders, and that's not something that the city particularly seems to care about, regardless of who the perpetrator is. In this case, the perpetrator was someone who had a bunch of crimes already attributed to him, someone who I believe was out on bail, someone who clearly should have been still involved in the criminal justice system, being monitored, something like that. I think he has a court date coming up in March. What was this guy doing out on the street? Is this somebody, one of these nonviolent people who is just going to be released on their own recognizance in order that they can kill people? You know, what's going on? I think that has a lot more to do with it. If you have someone who's a criminal, who is capable of committing more criminal acts, why are we letting them just go wander around to keep killing our citizens? What's that about?
And also, I want to bring up that is exactly the same situation with Breonna Kupfer as well here in Los Angeles, was that the man who killed her was out on bail for previous crimes. It's a very similar connection, very similar sounding case, actually, in many regards.
Yeah, I just want to go back again to the fact, like this idea that maybe, you know, that this is happening to all women. I don't want to erase the fact that these violent crimes are happening to Asian women. And, you know, we're coming up now on the 1-year anniversary of the terrible murder of Asian women in Atlanta, the terrible shootings that happened. The gunman went into multiple Asian-owned establishments to shoot down women of color, and was then described as having a bad day. So let's not forget that these crimes are happening against Asian women. We have to acknowledge it and recognize that that's the case, because if we don't do that, we won't get the resources that we need to the Asian community that, you know, we so desperately need to address these issues that are happening.
And what makes criminal justice reform so difficult is the way that it is driven by individual stories, tragic stories like these. If you look at more broadly, if you look at the statistics around, say, bail reform, you find that in places where they have implemented bail reform, you actually wind up with less violent crime than in places that haven't implemented bail reform. But obviously, if you're going to implement bail reform, some of the people who are out on bail are going to commit horrific crimes. And it's much easier to tie, okay, they were let out on bail last fall after an assault. I think it involved a stolen fare card. They were let out on bail and then they committed this horrific murder. It's harder to step back and say, okay, holistically, because of the criminal justice reforms that were implemented, there was less violence generally, and therefore this thing didn't happen. Like, that's just a hard argument to make in the media, and so you end up seeing a lot of stories that say, person let out on bail ended up killing somebody, and to the families of those people who are no longer with us, the statistics don't matter because their loved one is gone as a result.
Yeah.
But thank you, Libby. Thank you, Grace. Appreciate you joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we'll have more Rising right after this.